Hello again, and God be with you. Well, it's nice to be able to tell you another story. Another story where some of you will be in school and some of you will still be home. I'm just about to start the first of 5 stories, of which children play an important part. Would you feel nervous about speaking to a very important person like the Queen or the Prime Minister? Today's story is about a very important person. His name is Naaman. He was the commander of the whole army. The story is also about a little servant girl. She wasn't important at all. In fact, she was so unimportant that we don't even know her name. So if you're ready, I'll open the book at the story called The Helpful Servant. Naaman was a soldier. Not just any soldier, but the commander of the whole Syrian army. He was a very powerful man, but he was afraid. Naaman, you see, was ill, and no one knew how to make him well. His skin was covered with sores, and he couldn't feel his fingers or his feet. Everyone felt sorry for him, and God felt sorry too. So God whispered to a little girl who had been captured by Naaman's army and carried away from God's promised land. She worked for Naaman's wife, and one day she said to her mistress, "Back in Israel, where I come from, there lives a man called Elisha. God uses him to make sick people well. If only Naaman could go and see him." And before long, the great soldier who had fought against God's people was off to seek help from God's prophet. Naaman didn't go alone. He took his servants and his horses and a chariot full of treasure to reward Elisha in case his cure should work. It was a grand parade, and Naaman expected a grand greeting in return. But when he sent one of his men to knock on Elisha's door, the prophet did not even answer. Instead, he told his servant Gehazi to say, "If you want to be well, go and dip yourself 7 times in the river Jordan." Now, it may be that Naaman was tired and frustrated, or it may be simply that he was proud. Whatever the reason, the prophet's message made him angry. "The Jordan River?" he shouted. "It's filthy. I'll throw myself into any river back in Syria, but I will not stick one toe into the Jordan, or take the advice of a man who cannot even be bothered." "Begging your pardon, sir," mumbled one of Naaman's servants, "but if the prophet had sent you off to do something hard, you would have gone straight away, wouldn't you?" "Of course," grunted Naaman. "Any soldier would." "Well then, why can't you go and do something easy, like washing in the river? It can't hurt, and it might just work." Naaman sighed. "All right," and led his men to the river. He dipped himself twice. Nothing. He dunked himself twice more. His skin was as ugly as ever. Twice more. And still no cure. Naaman was getting angry again. But when he came up for the 7th time, spluttering and shaking the water from his face, Naaman's men let out a cheer. Naaman opened his eyes and looked at his hands. The sores were gone from all over his body. Naaman dressed and hurried back to Elisha's house. The prophet himself answered the door this time, and Naaman could not contain his joy. Take this treasure, take it all, Naaman begged, for you have saved my life. But Elisha said no, for it was God, after all, who had healed Naaman. All right then, said Naaman, scooping up a pile of earth. Let me take this with me, so that I can stand on a piece of your land and worship your God too. Elisha nodded and smiled. And God smiled too, for with a little girl and a muddy river, he had turned an enemy into a friend. Well, who do you think really was the most important person in that story? Without the servant girl, Naaman would never have known about Elisha, and he would never have heard about Elisha's God. So she was very important after all. Close your eyes and think about the people who help you when you are unwell. It might be the doctors and nurses. It might be your family or your friends. Say a silent thank you to them now. Now I'm going to say a prayer, and if you want to make it your prayer, say Amen at the end. Dear God, thank you for using a little girl to help Naaman get better. Please be with anyone we know who is ill today and help them get better too. Amen. Well, Naaman was suffering from a disease called leprosy. It was very common in the times of Jesus, and at that time there was no known cure. It was very contagious, and so sufferers were forced to live away from other people. Whilst we can cure the disease today, we haven't completely eliminated it. In 2018, there were still more than 200,000 cases reported in 159 different countries. There are similarities between leprosy and COVID-19. Whilst one is contracted from a bacteria and the other from a virus, both are easily passed from one person to another. While we wait for a vaccine to be developed to protect us from coronavirus, we are in a similar position to the people in Bible times with leprosy. Our story today focused on God curing Naaman. It mentioned Elisha's servant Gehazi. The Bible tells us what happened to him after Naaman returned home. If you'd like to know, you can find out by reading to the end of the second book of Kings, chapter 5. Well, that's the end of this week's story. God be with you, and I'll see you next week.